Alright, welcome back to the channel, my friends. Warhammer Man Studios. I'm Warhammer Man, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Warhammer Old World. And if you're not familiar with the Old World, that was basically Warhammer Fantasy Battles, which was the original iteration of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. So Warhammer Fantasy Battles and Sigmar parallel Warhammer 40k and Horus Heresy in many ways. Essentially, Warhammer 40,000 is the current future space Warhammer universe, and Warhammer Age of Sigmar is the current fantasy kind of magic setting. The Horus Heresy was Warhammer 40,000, but in the year 30,000, essentially like 10,000 years before, or like the old way things used to be during the big civil war taking place between humanity. In the same way that this article we're about to take a look at talks about many of those same similarities taking place in the Old World, which was eventually destroyed and then rebuilt into Sigmar. But before we do all of that, we want to talk about essentially what were the main issues with Warhammer Fantasy that made them get rid of the Old World and then create this new world, Age of Sigmar. So first and foremost, the main issue was the game just wasn't doing all that well relative to Warhammer 40,000. And at the time, you could attribute some of that to the idea of space and guns and all that stuff being cooler than magic and fantasy and all of that type of stuff. The game was also a rank and flank type of game, rather than the system that Warhammer 40,000 uses, where essentially you have a 2-inch unit coherency, and it's now used in Age of Sigmar. Back then, you used to have square bases, and you would line up all your guys on this little rank and flank type movement tray, and you would have to wheel with your guys and pivot, and it was very complicated, very subjective, and just overall not a good system. But that's not the only reason they decided to kill off the Old World and start new. One of the primary reasons, and arguably the most important reason, was there was a big court case set precedents for the future of Games Workshop and its IP. They essentially tried to go after some competition for using their intellectual property and lost that court case because essentially the names that they were going after were too generic. So they started to rename the factions of Warhammer 40,000. So Space Marines became Adeptus Astartes. Chaos Space Marines became Heretic Astartes. Imperial Guard became Astra Militarum. And so on and so forth, so that they could copyright these names and stop people from using them the same way they could not with the generic names. And this was the same situation that took place with Warhammer Fantasy Battles versus Age of Sigmar. When they renamed everything, all of the factions in Age of Sigmar, they switched over from generic names like Wood Elves to Sylvaneth, from High Elves to Lumineth Realm Lords. Dark Elves became Daughters of Cain. Goblins became Gloomspite Gits, and so on and so forth, essentially allowing them to capture the IP and protect these names from competition. So that being said, now that we know the real reason that they killed off the Old World, we can take a look at why they're now deciding to bring it back and what we can expect to be different. The Old World Development Diary. Explore the war-torn lands of the world that was. It's been a while since we made the first cryptic announcement of a return of the Old World in 2019. Many of you have clamored to know more, and now it's time for Rob Alderman, the Warhammer Studio, to explore the gripping settlement of Warhammer, the Old World, in more detail than ever before. We've hinted at the unprecedented amount of work that has gone into the new game and its setting. In candlelit secrecy behind the great oaken portcullis doors of the Warhammer Studio, the Old World team has dedicated countless hours to search and playtesting. Our goal is to create a game that captures the best elements of all the editions of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, but at the same time providing new and exciting rules and fresh challenges to overcome. The Old World. One of the most important aspects of Warhammer, the Old World, is the setting itself. Obviously, this is the world that was, a world of legend destroyed by machinations of the ruinous powers of chaos at the culmination of the end of times. An event that doomed the denizens of the Old World to oblivion and heralded the birth of the mortal realms and the Age of Sigmar. It is important to remember that even though the setting is returning, these events still happened, and that Old World was destroyed. The end times had long been foreshadowed in the background of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. The Great War against Chaos. With the end of the world well documented, the design team wanted to explore the earlier history of the Old World in more depth, to examine events in the history of Warhammer in more detail than ever before. But which part of its long and storied history should they focus on? Go too far back in time, to the War of the Beard or the time of Sigmar, for example, and the setting would have become unfamiliar. This led us to events well known to the fans of the Old World, the Great War against Chaos and the Siege of Prague, 2 centuries before the end times. More precisely, we decided to look into the decades prior to the legendary world-changing event. In those years before the Chaos Lord Azavar Kull led his armies south against the nations of men and dwarves. The Empire of Man was not the unified nation that bravely faced the armies of Archaon that players of Warhammer Fantasy Battle will remember. Instead, it was deeply divided and ravaged by war following long centuries without the unifying presence of a single emperor. And now a quick message from this week's sponsor. This video is sponsored by CMOgames.com, where you can get 15% off most Games Workshop pre-orders, and they go live right at midnight Saturday mornings. CMOgames.com offers free shipping on orders over $25 in the US 48, and most orders ship within 24 hours. CMOgames.com has been selling Games Workshop products online for more than 20 years, and customer service is their top priority. CMOgames.com carries the full line of Games Workshop products, including 40K, Age of Sigmar, Kill Team, warcry, paints, hobbies, and tools. Visit CMOgames.com using the affiliate link in the description below so they know you heard about CMOgames.com from Warhammer Man Studios. Now, back to the video. Anarchy and the Empire. Following the death of the famed Emperor Mandred von Zelt, the Elector Counts were unable to decide upon a successor. When the Countess of Talabecland and the Count of Stirland mobilized their armies to claim the imperial throne by force, the lands of the Empire fell into civil war. In the centuries that followed, numerous claimants to the imperial throne emerged, deepening the divides between the provinces of the Empire and prolonging the civil war. Thus, at the time Warhammer the Old World is set, in the years before the Siege of Prague, the Empire stands divided, riven by intrigue and beset by internecine war. Of the many provinces that once formed the Empire, 4 stand tall, their mighty rulers pressing their claim for the imperial throne and hoping to reunify the fractured realm. The Barony of Westerland. Ruled by Elspeth Margreta VI, Westerland is a wealthy province. Its merchant lords grown fat on the trade that flows through Marienburg's vast harbors. The Grand County of Osterland. Ruled from the great city of Middenheim by the Count Sigismund Ulrich, Osterland is home to the Wolf Emperors of the North, fierce devotees of Ulrich. The Principality of Reichland. Occupying the heartland of Sigmar's empire, Reichland is ruled by the pious Prince Wilhelm I of Altdorf, a devout servant of the Emperor's patron deity. The Grand Duchy of Talabek. The largest and most culturally diverse of the 4 provinces, Talabek is ruled from the great walled city of Talabheim by Duke Ludwig XII. In Warhammer the Old World, we discover an empire weakened by centuries of civil war, vulnerable to the ever-present threat posed by rampaging armies of invaders. Beastmen Brayherds surge from the deep forest, burning and defiling all that stands before them. From the moors and mountains come roving bands of orcs and goblins, looting and pillaging, while in distant and forgotten lands ancient kings sit upon crumbling thrones, planning the reconquest of the lands of the living. Yet behind these present threats looms the specter of something far greater, the armies of Azavar Kull amassing in the north. While we know that the Empire would ultimately unify under the leadership of the great Magnus the Pious and turn back the armies of chaos, at what cost will this unity come? There are many stories to tell of the years before the Great War against chaos, and the desperate reunion of the end times. Truly, Warhammer the Old World promises to reveal much about the world that was, in ways sure to captivate fans of the Old World, old and young. So I do like that they touched on some of the questions that we have. It's cool to see that we're not going to be going back to the exact same timing of the previous Warhammer Fantasy Battles editions. We'll be still visiting the same setting so that it is memorable and recognizable, but we'll be doing it in a little bit of a prequel fashion. So I'm interested to hear what you think about the Old World. Do you like it? Do you prefer the newer setting of the Mortal Realms? Is it cool to have the various options? And also the way it's being discussed, a completely new game with a different rule set? Or would you rather see some of the rules in Sigmar transfer back over to it? I'm curious to see if it will come back as a rank and flank type game. I think that's much less likely, and then we're more likely to see it with some remnants of the old game, but more similar to the new iterations of Sigmar. That's it for today. Special thanks to CMO Games for sponsoring the video. Check them out to save 15%. I'm Warhammer Man. This is Warhammer Man Studios, and I'm out of here.